Hey there, folks. I'm Warhammer 40K Space Marine 2 released 13 years to the day after the original Space Marine launched, and it takes about 13 minutes to experience most of what Space Marine 2 has to offer. My enjoyment and high praise of Space Marine 2 is the direct result of appreciating and valuing generally in game design what I saw in those opening minutes. That is, a dark and desolate far future setting, wonderfully detailed environments, rhythmically thumping sound design, mostly tight and responsive controls, and lots and lots and lots of gore. In my opinion, these are Space Marine 2's greatest assets, and the remainder of the game, post-introduction, builds upon these qualities in simple yet effective ways. To set the stage within the Warhammer universe, a distress signal has been deployed by Archmagos Nozick, who's seeking defense assistance for a Project Aurora research facility on the jungle world of Kadaku from an invading Tyranid hive fleet. We are introduced as Dimitri and Titus, a Black Shield member of Death Watch kill team Primus, who are in transit to Kadaku to answer the call for support. Shortly after atmospheric entry, their transport is set upon by more than a few Tyranid gargoyles, tossing the veteran Space Marines from the craft and splintering them on the surface of the planet. Within moments of assuming control of Titus, we get a taste of the first aspect of Space Marine that I enjoy, the graphics and expansive environment design. The gameplay perspective is a semi-close, over-the-shoulder third-person view that is well suited to showing the small environmental details, as well as enabling players to pan across and appreciate the sweeping vistas of the visually open world. These large open environments are instrumental in conveying the feeling of being part of a massive-scale intergalactic conflict, which is important since the actual player navigation is single-corridor point-to-point travel. This immense sense of environmental scale persists beyond Kadaku, and is consistently manifest for the game's primary hub, the Battle Barge Resilient, an Adaptus Mechanicus research facility and administratum dome on Avarax, a sexy space drop sequence, and the otherworldly planet of Demirium. There's so much debris and miniature-scale interactions with the surrounding environments that it's hard not to appreciate the combined detail of the large scale and the small scale. In my opinion, these two components of the visual experience are very well synthesized together. The sense of scope in Space Marine 2 is not completely unlike the experience I remember when playing the first Gears of War game almost 20 years ago. Invoking the vaunted Gears of War, let's talk about the controls of Space Marine. Where Gears of War had a stop-and-pop gameplay cycle, Space Marine throws you into a large-scale but close-quarters gunplay and melee combat situation. Stopping for very long in Space Marine all but ensures a quick death, especially on higher difficulty settings. The means of enacting judgment on your enemies is pretty standard fare. There's a quick melee attack, a stronger, more capable heavy attack, several basic combos that can be performed, shield breaks, dodge rolling and parrying, and gruesomely awesome fatality finishing moves. In the early game, when the larger and more impactful shooting weapons haven't been unlocked, the dodge and parrying system is far more important than it is in the later game. Performing a dodge or parry opens the enemy up to a sort of quick-time event targeting sequence that does substantial damage from even small arms fire like the basic pistol. Thus, when you are engaged in combat with the faster, more aggressive enemy types, dodging and parrying is more of a necessity to ensure you are doing as much damage as possible. Additionally, the benefit of successfully activating this quick-time event is that your character remains unhittable throughout the full animation length. Toward the end of the campaign, after I'd unlocked the heavier equipment, I almost completely eliminated the parrying aspect from my playstyle, replacing it with a more straightforward shoot everything with the strongest possible projectile-based weapon, as opposed to counting on the extra damage afforded from successfully performing the parry sequence. The act of dodging, however, becomes more necessary throughout the game, as it becomes the primary means to avoid the sweeping attacks from bosses such as the Lictor, Carnifex, and Chaos Heretics. By the time I unlocked the Melter Rifle and Power Sword, there might as well have been no other weapons presented to me in the game. That combination touched the sweet spots. Speaking of the Melter Rifle, let me switch topics to that of the game's sound design. I personally believe sound design can make or break a game. Space Marine 2's sound design team are on freaking point with what they've produced here. From the ripping of flesh, to the methodical thud of Space Marines running, to the room-vibrating sound effects of the melter rifle, this game shines when inundating the player with viciously luscious sound effects and music. I firmly believe that the sound and music design is this game's version of the rug that ties the room together. And on that topic, once I found the melter rifle, I picked it up at every opportunity due to my inebriation with how baller sauce the sound of firing it is. Such as to be expected, I suppose, with weapons whose individual rounds are likely the size of a Gatorade bottle. While Titus himself is unlikely to ever be recognized as a master of executions in the Warhammer universe, with the amount of fatalities you'll perform across the campaign, he might as well be. Decapitations and disembowelments with the chainsword are a dime a dozen. Close-range headshots are prevalent even during the heat of melee combat. Environments are littered with the corpses of those who found their end on the battlefield. Space Marine 2 is filled with the kind of crushing violence you'd expect from the Warhammer universe. I'd go as far as to say that if the sight of repeated fatalities is something you'd get tired of quickly, Space Marine 2 might not be for you. There isn't quite the variety of kill moves that you'd find in Mortal Kombat, for example, but the prevalence of them is practically non-stop for the 8-hour or so single-player campaign. The executions themselves are woven into the gameplay loop fairly deeply. As with every kill move executed, you regain a small bit of armor, which you typically find yourself in short supply of due to the number of and ferocity of enemies you'll encounter. There is some slight variation on these finishers depending on the melee weapon you are holding and the enemy being executed, but you will undoubtedly start to notice repetition in the different finishing moves fairly quickly. My personal summary of Space Marine 2's positive characteristics are its excellent attention to large and small-scale environmental design, its tight control scheme, awesome sound design, and unrelenting and brutal combat. If you too appreciate these qualities, there's a good chance you'll enjoy what Space Marine 2 has to offer. There are some minor aspects to the game's presentation that I thought could have been handled more effectively. I'll say from the very beginning that these observations are minor, but as a highly critical person, I can't help but call these out for folks who might operate with a similarly critical lens. One aspect of gameplay that I thought was criminally underutilized was the use of the Ultramarines' Prometheum Thrust jump pack. Though it takes a few jumps to get acclimated to the control scheme, once getting the hang of jumping, hovering, and then ground slamming, it's a ton of fun to disperse an entire pack of enemies with a drop from the sky. While I'm not necessarily advocating for this mobility and combat alteration to be available for the entire campaign duration, it felt like too central of an Ultramarine's loadout characteristic to have only included a couple of times. Don't expect any revelations with the narrative mechanicus here either. For me, this was the lowest point of the total experience. You'll make your way to the battle barge Resilient, which is the central hub of the story, receive a mission from gruff Captain Akaran, banter with your squad mates on the working elevator ride to the dropship, arrive at your destination and discover a non-working elevator or power grid, find a manual route around that inconvenience, kill a ton of Tyranids on the way, discover something unthinkable in the closing level cinematic, and repeat those steps until the end credits roll. It seems like the game industry has struggled for a long time to devise a means of interestingly moving a story forward. But to me, Space Marine 2's method of narrative progression could have been designed by first-year university students in a game design program. And I know that because I've worked with first-year university students in a game design program. While it's not exclusively busted elevators you have to work with, the tropes of stalled progression resonate across familiar topics. The broken elevator, the failing battlefront that can only be improved by your presence, the blocked path you didn't expect and need to navigate through a more dangerous route. This is the kind of galactic resistance you'll have to address throughout the course of the game. There are some pretty amazing grander battles to take part in, but looking a little closer, these encounters are largely cinematic billboards that closer inspection will take some of the luster off of. Space Marine 2 offers an expansive world with unrelenting waves of Tyranid swarms coming at you. But if you look closely enough, we can observe that the majority of enemies you actually face are but a small number crawling out of the stack, as opposed to the whole stack eventually coming at you. The design team wisely made these stacks of enemies at least somewhat deformable, enabling you to shoot them or throw grenades into the pile and see them come crashing down. As best I can tell, the only advantage a player might gain from shooting the Tyranid stacks at all is that they might spew out a few less enemies you actually have to deal with before the sequence ends. I've completed several of these overrun scenarios without firing a single shot or throwing a single grenade into the swarm stacks. Similarly, when I perform speed runs through levels, there have been moments where I felt like I've been a little bit ahead of the game logic, finding myself in an area too early, causing me to briefly see enemies spawning out of thin air. On the normal difficulty, your two-party companions, Gadriel and Chiron, serve almost exclusively as mobile respawn tools. They'll engage with the enemy well enough that it doesn't feel like they are totally throwaway, but for the most part, the purpose of their existence is revivification of Titus when he falls in battle. The corresponding squad controls are functional at an extremely basic level, but by the time the game really gets rolling, you won't have enough time to manage their activities and your own. I found myself perfectly content letting them do their own thing, as long as they revived me when I needed it. The final two, and smallest irritations I have, are that I would have liked to have seen at least a single orc battle be rolled somewhere into the overall package. And, despite the so large it's impossible to estimate size of the Tyranid swarm, there seems to have only been one locksmith in the entire galaxy, as every single door is unlocked with exactly the same key code combination. While I didn't call it out in the beginning, one of Space Marine 2's greatest assets is its ability to harness chaos as an advantage. I can't tell you the number of times I accidentally did something in combat that turned out looking and sounding amazing. If you like third-person shooters in beautifully crafted environments, with wonderfully thumping sound design and tons of gore, you'll probably end up liking Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. I know I did. I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration. Thanks for watching, and out.